I found out my marriage was dying because my father called me from a hospital bed and asked why my wife was having dinner with another man while I was supposedly out of town. And I swear to God I can still hear the oxygen machine behind his voice when he said, "Michael, I almost didn't call because I thought maybe I was confused, but a father knows when his son's life is being rearranged behind his back." That was how my normal Thursday ended, not with some dramatic scream or a broken glass, but with me frozen in my car outside a grocery store, holding a bag of melting ice cream for a woman I still thought loved me, while my father described the red dress she wore on a night she told me she was too exhausted to leave the house. For context, we had been married 11 years, together for 14, and for most of that time I would have told anybody that our problems were the ordinary kind, the kind you survive with patience, humor, and a few hard conversations. Lately, though, she had changed in ways that were small enough to deny and sharp enough to hurt. She smiled at her phone and turned the screen away from me. She started picking fights over things that made no sense, like the way I folded towels or the fact that I asked whether she wanted tea. She began speaking to me with this polished little contempt that made every sentence sound like a performance, and when I asked what was wrong, she would lean back, cross her arms, and say, "You always want there to be a problem because then you get to feel like the victim, and frankly, I am too tired to manage your emotions for you." That line sat in my chest for weeks, because I kept trying to be fair to her, trying to believe stress had just made her meaner than she intended to be. But then the lies started stacking on top of each other in ways that made me feel insane. She said she had late meetings, but her office told me the team had been working remote. She said her friend Nina was going through a crisis, but Nina's husband casually asked me at a barbecue why we had not been around lately because they had barely seen my wife in a month. She said she wanted more honesty between us, then changed her phone password and laughed when I noticed, saying, "What, now I need a security clearance to exist in my own house?" Even then, I was still reaching for innocent explanations, which is humiliating to admit, because deep down I already knew I was standing in a room full of smoke, pretending I did not smell fire. So after my father's call, I drove home with my heart slamming against my ribs, and there she was in the kitchen, barefoot, calm, beautiful, stirring pasta sauce like she had not spent the evening starring in the collapse of my life. I set the grocery bag on the counter and asked, as evenly as I could, "How was your exhausting night at home?" And she did not even flinch before saying, "Lonely, actually, but thanks for asking in that tone." Then I told her my father had seen her across town with a man in a navy jacket, and for 1 second, just one, the mask slipped. She looked at me with this cold, furious calculation, then shrugged and said, "Your father is old, dramatic, and half-blind. So if you are going to put his paranoia above my word, then maybe this marriage has bigger problems than I thought." I remember staring at her and feeling something precious tear inside me, because it was not just the possible betrayal that crushed me in that moment. It was how quickly she turned it into my shame, my overreaction, my failure to trust. I slept on the couch that night, fully clothed, listening to her move around upstairs, and sometime before dawn, I realized the first real loss had already happened. Before I knew the whole truth, before I had proof, before the real nightmare even began, I had lost the version of her that used to feel safe. I wish I could say the next morning brought clarity, but what it actually brought was a strange performance of normalcy that felt almost theatrical, because she walked into the kitchen wearing the same calm smile she used when we hosted friends, poured coffee into 2 mugs, and said in this soft, measured voice, "I hope you had enough time on the couch to calm down, because I refuse to start my day defending myself against something your father imagined." I remember staring at her across the table and feeling like I was watching a stranger wear my wife's face, because the confidence in her voice was so steady that for a moment I actually wondered if my father had been wrong, and that doubt alone made me angry with myself in a way I cannot fully explain. When I told her that he described the restaurant, the man, the red dress she was wearing, she leaned back in her chair and sighed like a tired teacher dealing with a slow student and said, "Michael, if you want to destroy our marriage over a coincidence and an old man's eyesight, then you are doing a very thorough job. For most of that morning, she treated me like the unreasonable one, moving around the kitchen with controlled patience while explaining that she had stopped by a cafe near her office to pick up takeout and that someone must have mistaken her for someone else. And the way she spoke made everything sound so polished and rational that I almost hated myself for pushing the subject further. But something in me had already shifted during that phone call with my father. Something quiet and stubborn that refused to go back to sleep. So while she was upstairs getting ready for work, I opened the shared laptop we kept in the living room and checked the location history tied to her account, which was something I had never even thought about before. My hands were shaking while the map loaded, and when it finally appeared, I saw the small blue dot sitting exactly where my father said it had been the night before. Not near her office, not near our house, but at a restaurant across town that specialized in candlelit dinners and expensive wine. When she came back downstairs, I was still staring at the screen, and I remember looking up at her and saying quietly, "You were there, so please stop treating me like I am inventing things." For a brief second, the room went silent in a way that made my skin prickle, and then she did something I never expected. Instead of apologizing or panicking, she laughed, a soft, controlled laugh that sounded almost pitying, and said, "So now you are spying on me too, which honestly tells me much more about you than it does about me." She walked over, closed the laptop with deliberate calm, and leaned close enough that I could see the irritation behind her eyes while she whispered, "You are becoming paranoid, Michael. And if you keep pushing this fantasy, you are going to break something you cannot repair." I should have felt reassured by how confident she sounded, but instead something colder settled in my chest, because her reaction was too practiced, too composed, and while she walked out the door, she added one last line over her shoulder that stayed with me the entire day. "Maybe next time your father thinks he sees me somewhere, you should ask him who I was with before you start accusing your wife." At first, that sentence felt like another dismissal, another attempt to make me question my sanity. But by the afternoon, something about it started to bother me, because she had not asked what my father said about the man at the restaurant. She had not asked what he looked like, or whether he spoke to them, or how long he watched. It was as if she already knew exactly what my father had seen. That evening, I decided I needed proof, not arguments, because arguing with her felt like trying to hold smoke in my hands while she calmly explained that the fire did not exist. I sat in my car outside the restaurant my father mentioned, not even fully sure what I expected to see, just staring at the entrance while the sun sank and the lights inside began to glow through the windows. I told myself that maybe this was all paranoia and that I would feel ridiculous when she walked through our front door later with groceries or some boring explanation about work. But around 7:30, I saw her car pull into the parking lot, and my stomach dropped so fast that for a moment I actually felt dizzy, because she stepped out wearing that same red dress my father described, the one she supposedly wore only for special events with me. She walked toward the restaurant with this easy confidence that made my chest tighten, and then the man appeared beside her like someone stepping out of a shadow. He was taller than me, clean-cut, wearing the navy jacket my father mentioned, and the two of them laughed together in a way that felt painfully familiar, because it was the exact laugh she used when we used to go on dates during the early years of our marriage. I sat there gripping the steering wheel while they disappeared inside, and for a long time I just stared at the door, hoping they would come back out quickly so I could tell myself it was some harmless work meeting. They did come out eventually, but not quickly, and not alone. When they finally stepped outside more than 2 hours later, they were close enough together that there was no confusion about what I was seeing, and the way she looked at him carried a warmth I had not seen directed at me in months. My heart was pounding so loudly that I barely noticed another car pulling into the lot behind me until someone knocked on my window, and when I turned my head, I felt the world tilt sideways, because the person standing there was my friend Daniel. Daniel had been part of my life for nearly 15 years, the kind of friend who helped me move apartments, who stood next to me at my wedding, who knew every private story about my relationship because I trusted him more than almost anyone. When I rolled the window down, he looked confused and said, "Michael, what are you doing sitting out here like you're waiting for a stakeout?" And before I could answer, his eyes shifted toward the restaurant entrance just as my wife stepped out again beside the man in the navy jacket. The silence that followed felt thick and unbearable. Daniel's expression changed instantly, not with surprise, but with something much worse, something that looked dangerously close to recognition. He stared at the man beside my wife for a long moment, and then looked back at me with a strange tension in his face, before saying slowly, "Michael, I think you need to tell me how long you have known about this." That was the second moment my life cracked open, because his question made it clear that whatever was happening in front of me had been unfolding longer than I realized, and suddenly the betrayal I was witnessing felt less like an accident and more like a story everyone else had already been reading while I was still stuck on the first page. When Daniel asked how long I had known, something inside me tightened in a way that felt almost physical, like my chest had suddenly become too small for my lungs. I remember staring at him through the open car window while the restaurant lights reflected in the glass behind him, and I said slowly, "Known what, Daniel? Because if you are about to tell me this is not exactly what it looks like, then you should probably stop right there." He rubbed the back of his neck in that nervous way he always did when conversations became uncomfortable, and for a moment, he did not answer. Instead, he looked back toward the restaurant again where my wife was still standing with the man in the navy jacket, laughing at something he said as if the world had not just cracked open a few meters away. Finally, Daniel leaned down closer to the window and spoke in a lower voice that carried a strange mix of caution and guilt. "Michael, I thought you already knew about him because she told people you two were basically separated and just keeping things quiet until you figured out the legal stuff." For a few seconds, I honestly thought I had misheard him, because the idea that my wife had been telling people we were separated felt so absurd that my brain refused to process it properly. I shook my head slowly and said, "We are not separated, Daniel. We had dinner together 3 nights ago, and she asked me to fix the light in the hallway yesterday." His face changed immediately, and the color drained from it in a way that made my stomach twist. He straightened up and looked at me with an expression that carried the heavy silence of someone realizing they had just revealed something they were not supposed to say. "She told us months ago that things between you two were basically over," he continued carefully, "and that you were both just staying in the same house until you decided how to handle the divorce without making things ugly." That sentence hit me harder than seeing her with the other man, because betrayal from a stranger hurts differently than betrayal that has been quietly rehearsed behind your back. I felt my hands start shaking on the steering wheel while Daniel kept talking, trying to soften the damage with explanations that somehow made everything worse. He told me that a few people in our circle had met the guy before, that she introduced him as someone she had been seeing after the separation, and that everyone believed the situation was complicated but honest. Then he said something that made the ground shift again beneath my feet. "She said you were the one who wanted the separation, Michael, and that you had already moved on emotionally months ago." For a moment I could not even speak, because suddenly the entire story she had been telling people painted me as the distant husband who abandoned the marriage first, the cold one who created the space that allowed her to move on. The cruelty of it felt almost surgical, like she had carefully rewritten our entire relationship so that if the truth ever surfaced, she would already look like the reasonable one. I was still trying to process that when Daniel hesitated again and added quietly, "And Michael, there is something else you probably should know about the guy she is with." When I asked him what he meant, he looked back toward the restaurant entrance once more, exhaled slowly, and said words that made the night suddenly feel much darker. "That man is not a stranger to you." When Daniel said the man was not a stranger to me, I felt this slow, sickening dread crawl up my spine, because there are only so many people in your life who could make that sentence truly devastating. I asked him who it was, and the hesitation on his face lasted just long enough to make my stomach twist before he finally said, "Michael, that is Ryan." For a moment the name did not land, because my brain refused to place it where it belonged. And then the realization hit me with the force of a collapsing wall. Ryan was not just someone I knew. Ryan was my wife's boss. I had met him at company parties, shaken his hand at holiday events, listened to him compliment her work while I stood beside her feeling proud of how well she was doing. I even remembered one dinner where he told me, with a warm smile and a glass of wine in his hand, that my wife was one of the most dedicated people on his team and that the company was lucky to have her. At the time, I thought he was just being polite. Now I was sitting in a dark parking lot watching my wife laugh with him like they had been sharing private jokes for months. Daniel continued talking in that careful tone people use when they realize they are standing in the middle of a disaster. He told me that a few co-workers had seen them together before, that they had started showing up at events as a pair weeks ago, and that my wife always explained it by saying the marriage had quietly ended, but that I preferred to keep things private. According to the version of reality she had been presenting, I was the distant husband who had already emotionally checked out, the man who was too proud to admit the relationship was over. But the next twist hit even harder. Daniel suddenly frowned and said something that made my chest tighten again. "Wait, if you did not know about Ryan, then why did she tell me last month that you were already seeing someone else too?" The words felt like they came from another universe. I stared at him and said, slowly and clearly, "Daniel, I am not seeing anyone." He blinked in confusion and ran a hand through his hair before continuing. "Michael, she told me you had started seeing a woman from your gym and that the two of you were basically living separate lives already. She even said you admitted it during one of your arguments." That was the moment I understood the scale of what she had done. She had not just been hiding an affair. She had been building an entire alternate story about our marriage, quietly planting it in the minds of the people around us so that when the truth surfaced, she would already look like the injured party. And while I was still trying to process that manipulation, my phone suddenly vibrated in my hand. It was a message from my wife. "Where are you tonight?" she wrote. Then another message appeared seconds later. "Ryan just offered to drive me home because my car is acting weird." I looked up from the screen and saw her walking toward Ryan's car in the parking lot, smiling at something he said, completely unaware that I was sitting 20 meters away watching the lie unfold in real time. But the worst part was still coming, because as Daniel stared at my phone screen, his expression changed again, and he said something that made my blood run cold. "Michael, if she thinks Ryan is driving her home tonight, then whose car did she leave here 2 hours ago?" When Daniel asked whose car she had arrived in, my first instinct was to dismiss the question as meaningless, because my brain was already drowning in too many revelations to process another one. I told him she must have driven herself earlier and simply planned to leave with Ryan. But Daniel shook his head slowly while staring across the parking lot with a look that made my pulse begin to race again. "Michael," he said carefully, "I have been here for 40 minutes waiting for a takeout order, and that car of hers never moved. She didn't arrive tonight." I followed his gaze back toward the restaurant entrance, and suddenly the scene I had been watching for hours started to feel wrong in a way I had not noticed before. Her car had been sitting in the same spot the entire time, quiet and untouched under the streetlight, which meant she had arrived here earlier in the day with someone else. That realization barely had time to settle before the next twist appeared. Another car pulled into the lot, slow and deliberate, headlights sweeping across the pavement before stopping a few spaces away from Ryan's vehicle. At first, I paid almost no attention to it, because my entire focus was still on my wife standing beside Ryan, smiling while he unlocked his car door. Then the driver stepped out, and my stomach dropped so violently that I actually grabbed the steering wheel to steady myself. The man walking toward them was Mark. Mark had been my closest friend since college, the one who helped me paint the walls of our first apartment, the one who toasted our marriage during the wedding reception while promising he would always have our backs. He was also the man who had borrowed my truck just 2 nights earlier because he said his own car was in the shop. But the car he stepped out of now was not his truck. It was my wife's. I watched in stunned silence as Mark walked directly toward them with the casual confidence of someone who absolutely belonged there. My wife turned the moment she saw him, and the smile that spread across her face was something I had not seen directed at me in months. She stepped forward, hugged him tightly, and then looked back toward Ryan while saying something I could not hear. The three of them stood there together laughing under the parking lot lights like characters in a scene I was never supposed to witness. Beside me, Daniel whispered something under his breath that sounded dangerously close to disbelief. "Michael, why would Mark be driving your wife's car?" I had no answer. All I knew was that the situation I thought I understood 5 minutes earlier had just mutated into something far stranger and far darker than a simple affair. Because as I watched them talk, something became painfully obvious. Ryan was not the center of that conversation. Mark was. And the way my wife looked at him carried a kind of familiarity that made the betrayal I thought I understood suddenly feel incomplete, like I had only been seeing the surface of something much deeper. Watching Mark walk toward them felt like someone had quietly removed the floor beneath my life while I was still standing on it. For years he had been the one person I trusted without hesitation, the guy who knew every fight my wife and I had ever had, the one who sat across from me at bars while I tried to understand why she had been so distant lately. I remembered the way he used to nod sympathetically while saying things like, "Relationships go through cold seasons, man. Just give her time and she'll come back around." And now he was standing in the same parking lot with her and the man I thought was the center of this whole nightmare, laughing like the three of them shared some private joke that had been building for months. I could feel Daniel beside me shifting uncomfortably, because the longer we watched the scene unfold, the stranger it became. Ryan opened the back door of his car like he was about to leave, but instead of getting in, my wife leaned toward Mark and said something that made him shake his head while smiling. Then Ryan clapped him on the shoulder in a way that looked almost congratulatory, like two colleagues celebrating something that had gone exactly according to plan. That was the moment my stomach twisted into something colder than anger, because suddenly Ryan did not look like the man secretly stealing my wife. He looked like a man who already knew the entire situation. And then things got worse. My wife stepped closer to Mark and placed her hand on his chest while speaking to him in a tone that carried an intimacy I had never mistaken before in my life. Even from across the parking lot, I could see the softness in her posture, the quiet familiarity in the way she tilted her head while listening to him respond. Ryan stood beside them like a patient observer rather than a rival, occasionally adding a comment that made both of them laugh. Beside me, Daniel finally whispered, "Michael, this does not look like a normal affair." No, it did not, because what I was watching felt less like a secret romance and more like a group that had been working together. Then my phone vibrated again. Another message from my wife. "Mark stopped by the house earlier to return your truck," she wrote casually. "I might stay out with coworkers for a bit, so don't wait up." The lie was so bold it almost made me laugh out loud. Mark was not at my house earlier. Mark was standing in the same parking lot as my wife and Ryan, close enough that if I rolled down my window and shouted his name, he would hear me. But the final moment of that night twisted the knife even deeper, because while the three of them talked, Mark suddenly pulled something from his jacket pocket and handed it to my wife. Even from a distance, I could see what it was. It was a small envelope, and when she opened it, the look on her face was not surprise. It was recognition. Ryan leaned closer, smiling, and whatever he said next made my wife laugh softly while Mark placed his arm around her shoulders. I remember staring at that scene with a kind of hollow disbelief while one question kept echoing in my head. How long had all three of them been part of this story? Because whatever that envelope contained, it was clearly something they had already planned together. And somehow I had just become the last person to realize it. I sat there in the car long after Daniel stopped talking, long after the three of them finally separated in the parking lot, and the silence that filled that space felt heavier than any argument my wife and I had ever had. Ryan eventually drove away alone. My wife walked toward the car Mark had brought, and the two of them stood beside it for a moment, speaking quietly while the streetlight above them flickered. From a distance, it looked almost peaceful, The kind of quiet conversation two people have when they share something complicated but familiar. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands started to ache, because by that point I no longer knew what version of the story I was even watching anymore. But the final piece fell into place the next morning, and it did not come from spying or guessing or following anyone. It came from a phone call. A lawyer called me around 10 in the morning and asked if I had a moment to discuss the separation arrangements already initiated by my wife. I actually laughed when he said that. Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it made my brain stall. I told him there must be some mistake because we were not separated, and the man on the other end of the line paused before calmly explaining that my wife had already been consulting with his office for nearly 3 months. According to the documents she submitted, our marriage had been deteriorating for over a year due to my emotional withdrawal and suspected infidelity. When I heard those words, I felt the last illusion collapse. Because suddenly everything made sense. The lies she told our friends about us being separated, the story about me seeing another woman, the way she provoked arguments and then documented them, the careful narrative she had been building where I looked distant, unstable, and guilty. She was not just having an affair, she was building a case, and Ryan, the boss I thought was the other man, was actually the one who helped her secure a promotion that required relocating across the country. The envelope Mark handed her that night was not some romantic secret. It was paperwork, transfer papers. The final twist was not that my wife betrayed me with one man or even two. The final twist was realizing the entire story had been engineered so that when she left, everyone would believe she was escaping a failing marriage I had already ruined. That night in the parking lot was not the beginning of the betrayal. It was the celebration of its success. And the strangest part of all is that after the anger burned itself out, what stayed behind was something quieter. I realized that a relationship can end long before the truth is spoken out loud, and sometimes the person beside you is already writing the final chapter while you are still trying to understand the previous page. If anyone reading this ever feels that slow shift where honesty disappears and reality starts getting rewritten around you, trust that feeling sooner than I did. Because the worst part of betrayal is not the moment you discover it. It is realizing how long you were the only person who did not know.